So today, again, thanks so much for everybody tuning in. We want to try to cover kind of three areas today. It's really important to, when I think about, everybody talks about, oh, the cost of doing this. Well, it's really investment. This is not dollars that we're throwing out the window. These are dollars that we are investing in improving the performance and quality of our long-term assets. What we want to do is minimize the incremental cost to society of doing that. And kind of the obvious way for us, from our perspective, is to integrate this work into buildings' existing capital cycles. So what are the best points of intervention? I think it's pretty clear that it costs you less in the long term if you're replacing a boiler that has died and you're replacing it with a high efficiency heat pump versus coming into a building where everything's operating fine and just telling them, oh, do all of this expensive work because you need to do it today. So we really want to figure out how to get into these capital cycles. And that means we need to understand, we need to get to the building owners. So who are the decision makers within the building owning companies, and how do we reach them? I think we already have done a bunch of work activating the architects and the engineers, kind of the closest core players to building owner decision makers when they're thinking about building a new building or renovating their building. But then there's a broader cohort of other people who are involved in the real estate space that are, for example, real estate lawyers, appraisers, brokers, tax, accounting advisors. There's probably half a dozen else. We'll be asking you to let us know who else we need to be thinking about. And a part of this, the goal of today, is figuring out strategies to engage this broader cohort of players. And then the third part, another key stakeholder group is lenders. So couple things here is, how do we demystify this whole thing for kind of the mainstream financial community? How do we gain lender confidence in the performance of these retrofits? Again, like the building capital cycle, to the extent that we can work this financing into existing financial structures, it's just going to be easier to do. But that doesn't mean there aren't openings for new financial mechanisms, the PACE financing mechanism being a great example. So we're also interested in hearing, how can we develop innovative mechanisms that will help us achieve our goals. So with that, I'm going to introduce Scott Johnstone, but only if you give me the next slide. I should know this by heart since I've done this about a dozen times. But Scott, you may know him from his time with the Vermont Energy Efficiency Corporation, running that organization. Today, he is the Northeast Energy Market Leader for VHB, which is an engineering and science services company. He's also spent time in the state government in New Hampshire and Vermont, lives in Burlington, and is a great facilitator. So I'm going to turn it over to Scott's capable hands.
Great, thanks, Greg. Let me just do a sound check here. Can you hear me?
You're good.
Good, thank you. Welcome all. I'm pleased to be with you here today. And before we hop in, I did want to just take a moment in these times to just acknowledge all the feelings, emotions, prayers, thoughts that we all have for those who've lost their life, those who are struggling in hospital, awaiting test results, and all the anxiety and worry that comes with that. And even all of us who are sitting at home otherwise well, that are nervous about ourselves and our loved ones. So we all have those feelings, and so we're all processing and dealing with those. And as Greg noted earlier, that there's a benefit of this afternoon in that between now and perhaps 5 o'clock, we can cast our eyes out, 5 and 10 and 30 years about other huge problems in the world like climate change and decarbonization that we all share and know have to be addressed. So perhaps you'll feel like this is a nice diversion on a really important topic this afternoon. Perhaps you'll struggle through it a bit with us. Mostly before we launched, I just wanted to acknowledge that every feeling and emotion in between that range is rational, and hopefully we'll all find our way through this conversation in a useful way. So I am a person that appreciates the distraction. So again, I'm pleased to be with you. Next slide, please. So Greg also alluded, this is about the value of real estate here, this session, and decarbonization can either be something that we're required to do, and in many respects we're going to be required to do. And we also know, though, that many and all of the pieces of decarbonization have the opportunity to create and enhance value, both for building owners and tenants, whether it's commercial or residential. This has been long studied and implemented and piloted and become mainstream. And there's a lot of market barriers, and we're going to talk about those today, I'm sure. We're going to hear from lots of experts that will lay those out. On the screen, you see one array of those. You all could agree or disagree with some of those. I think mostly we'd agree with what's on here. We could build a bigger list, but there is value as we move towards the decarbonized buildings. And the key is, how do we make sure that that is acknowledged for building owners and tenants, and that it becomes more mainstream. And that's really part of what we're trying to get out of you today, is how do we move this forward so that people see the value? It's not just another capital expense. And of course, we've got to make sure that the capital's there and at a good rate and with the right rules. But ultimately, at the end of the day, how do we create value? So with that, we're going to hop in here. And this first session of speakers is going to be broken into two parts. I think you can go to the next screen here. And we're looking at this messaging and influencing decision makers. We're going to begin with messaging, and we're going to have one speaker first, and then we're going to hop into a second piece on here. But if you go to the next slide, and one more, this is the messaging. And so first, we're going to hear from Sadie McCown, who's the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Community Preservation Corporation and one of our co-hosts for this event. Thank you for that, Sadie. And in her role there, she oversees the company's construction lending and sustainability initiatives, leads the development and launch of CPC's lending subsidiary, which is a full-service operation focusing on Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, FHA. And she also spearheads the company's initiative underwriting efficiency practice that incorporates energy and water efficiency features into the financing of first mortgages for multifamily building owners. So we're going to hear from Sadie. I'm about to turn it over to her, and then we're going to have a brief discussion after that, and then we'll hop into a second panel. So Sadie, welcome. Please, I don't know if you're unmuting or someone's unmuting you, but
I'm here.
take it over.
Can you hear me?
I hear you perfectly, Sadie. Welcome.
Sound check. I'm good to go. All right. Thank you. I appreciate that welcome. And before I start, I too want to just acknowledge the unbelievably difficult time that people are going through, and send my thoughts and good wishes to everyone, and a big pat on the back to everybody for doing what was impossible to think could be done 2 weeks ago, and staying inside and completely changing the way we live and work to be home with our families and trying to stay safe and healthy. So I am going to ask you to go to the first slide. I don't have, my screen wasn't moving quickly, so I pulled the presentation up on my own screen. So I'm looking at the slide that says Uncommon Expertise, Unmatched Impact at the top. This is just a quick soundbite on CPC. We've been around since 1974. We were created after the fiscal crisis in the 70s to address disinvestment in New York City's neighborhoods. We are an aggregation of private capital that gets invested into low and moderate income communities. We've invested over $11 billion in our history, and almost 200,000 units of housing. You can go to the next slide. We do have a robust sustainability platform, which created after the fiscal crisis in 2008. We have a standalone team that I lead, and it has evolved over time. Started with just really trying to get people to change their light bulbs and be more energy efficient, to now pushing towards decarbonization and electrification in keeping with the city and state climate goals. We do what we can do with our private capital to try and influence decarbonization and electrification. Since we started measuring our energy efficient, high energy efficient units in 2013, we financed 7,000 of those. We always target high energy efficiency and decarbonization when we can in the buildings that we finance. We believe that the cost savings really adds value to properties. If you go to the next slide that talks about our sustainability mission, again, in keeping with our public partners, we are supporting their carbon neutral strategies as a company. We just recently went carbon neutral so that our tenant behavior in the buildings that we occupy is consistent with our statements around carbon neutral buildings. We've developed some cool tools around energy efficiency. We have a little tool called Verify that helps you estimate what you can save in a multifamily building. We wrote an underwriting efficiency guide for lenders to guide them through how to underwrite to high performance. And we are a partner with NYSERDA in the we're the financing partner for Retrofit New York, which we have supported since they launched that a few years back. We're on the target of the technical advisory group of the roadmap, which is the subject of today. And we're always looking and reaching towards new things to support sustainability in the work that we do. We're holding a carbon neutral summit at the end of May. I'm not sure if it'll be virtual at this point, but more to come on that. If you go to the next slide, this is just a quick list of our products. You can imagine today how busy we are as a both construction lender and a perm lender. We also invest equity in multifamily. All of our products are geared towards multifamily housing. So we're quite busy these days trying to shore up everything that's changing in the lending world, which we're hoping neutralizes and stabilizes within 3 to 6 months. If you go to the next slide, capital at scale, I like to look at this slide. It points out that we are a one-stop shop at CPC where you can come, access subsidy capital, navigate government programs, find tax abatements, et cetera. And we bring private capital in conjunction with public subsidy and other forms of public capital to try and invest in the neighborhoods that we serve, primarily low and moderate income. Although in upstate New York, it's a lot of downtown redevelopment, adaptive reuse of older buildings, converting those into housing. So if you go to the next slide, this is where my conversation about today begins. So I've been thinking about sustainability in multifamily real estate since 2008, when sustainability launched, 1,000 conferences and everybody started to mobilize as stakeholders. We engaged in 2008 after the recession because from our perspective, property owners were going into tough times because incomes would be flat or falling. At the time, oil was $150 a barrel, and owners of multifamily property were under enormous pressure. We got engaged really trying to help our owners drive down the cost in their buildings and on the expense side of the schedule versus just trying to elevate the income side of the schedule, which is how most people had been thinking about adding value to real estate. We were thinking you can add real value by lowering your expenses and increasing your NOI that way. We look at sustainability as value add, better air quality, sound and smell mitigation, temperature control all mean a more stable tenancy. Lower usage helps an owner withstand pricing spikes when markets move. Sustainable construction provides greater resiliency. And then green buildings appeal to tenants who want to make a contribution to the greater good. At the time, modest incentives were initially provided. They were there to seed initial interest in retrofits, inspire technological advances and creativity, and really to bait owners to try new technologies and new products, drive down their energy usage, and drive up their interest in doing more retrofitting. So if we go to the next slide, I want to underscore that incentives are really just that, they're incentives. And they should not be thought of as subsidies. And so sort of what's evolved, and remember, I primarily occupy the affordable housing space, but It became people didn't want to do energy efficiency unless somebody else would pay for it. And there just aren't enough incentives for that. So people started to think of subsidy as a way to pay for it. But subsidies are provided in deals to replace lost value. So think about rental subsidies are there to support a person's ability to pay a market rent, to replace the value that's lost when a landlord or an owner makes a decision to rent to low and moderate income people, which government programs support. And then buildings that, that rent to low and moderate income tenants, they lose value because they lose income. And that value that they've lost has to be subsidized in another way. Obviously, capital subsidies pay for that up front, and operating subsidies are ongoing, pay for that absence of cash flow. So subsidies are replacing or enhancing that lost value that you make the choice to rent to low and moderate income people. Incentives are there to spur new ideas, drive market transformation, create efficiencies, and really help drive some scale so that capital costs can be reduced because demand is going up. And as I mentioned, as a practical matter, there aren't enough incentives or subsidies in the world to cover the cost of changing the way that we use energy consistent with our new climate goals, right? So you could take every housing subsidy and every NYSERDA and utility incentive and put it all in a pot, and it would probably not even cover 5% of the built environment, right? So probably a whole lot less than that. So from CPC's perspective, we've been trying to incent or influence capital markets to adopt to new technologies, because to drive to decarbonization and electrification, all capital markets need to move to adapting these new technologies. So if you turn to the next slide, we've been at this since 2008. It's now 2020, and we're still talking about it. And the multifamily market really hasn't broadly adapted to deep energy retrofit and clean energy solutions. So you have to ask, why is that? And, there's some simple things like people are accustomed to business as usual. Change is harder than staying the same, right? I mean, there are early adopters out there. There are innovators. There are some really cool and inspirational owners that are doing amazing things. But if you drive through the neighborhoods where I finance buildings, mostly people aren't doing it. And so why is that? Well, the third thing is that since 2008, when the real estate market had lost so much value, we were pushing, well, you should really do sustainability. It will add value. But regardless of whether you implemented sustainable practices, real estate since 2008 soared. The value has really gone up tremendously, and that's for a number of other factors that I'm not going to get into. But in short, what it means is that there is this continued lack of demand to make our built environment more sustainable and move it towards decarbonization and electrification. So then I think about, okay, well, then what drives demand? Well, there's the proactive approach of marketing and branding. That's one thing. Then there are reactive approaches. Well, somebody else pays for it and they give me free money. So I like the example there is cash for clunkers. People were driving around all these gas guzzlers, and until somebody said, here, take this cash and park it forever, they would have kept driving around on it. So free money drove demand to get rid of old clunky cars. Then there's also market requirements, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then, of course, there's government regulation. So those are things that drive demand. So if we go to the next slide, let's talk more specifically about marketing and branding. What does multifamily currently market about their units? Their location, size and affordability, amenities. We value things in multifamily real estate today that, we value marble countertops and beautiful lobbies and dog walking and dog washing rooms. And, these are all things that are nice, but they really are not the kind of value that's going to make the buildings more sustainable. And we really need to pivot and try to figure out collaboratively, and that's one of the points of today, is to hear from you about how sustainability can be seen as a true value add, because it needs to be at this point. And so then ask the question, well, can't we simply pay for this with someone else's money? I talked about this. No, incentives are just incentives. Subsidy is a mismatch. And then also, like, you can't just come up with a number and say, oh, $5,000 a unit and everything can be electrified or decarbonized. It's just not that simple because there's too many different building types and there are too many different variables. So if we go to the next slide, then I think about requirements. And now you know, what are requirements as a multifamily owner? What requirements are you up against? Well, there's the building code. And Greg mentioned this earlier, and the code is evolving. And it needs to reach further and further towards electrification because when you go to get a permit, you have to comply with the code. So that's one requirement that everybody is subject to. And then there are the requirements of capital sources, and that's where, you know, my thinking cap is typically on. You know, subsidy sources do require standards, and HPD and HCR in New York State and lots of housing agencies across the country have started to require more sustainability in the buildings that they finance or that they subsidize. In New York, we use Enterprise Green Communities. But, you know, now it's probably the time, and it is being relooked at, to elevate those standards in light of these new goals and laws. So if you have a governor saying we have to get there by 2030, 2040, 2050, then all of the programs that touch carbon producing buildings and systems and manufacturing, et cetera, that same message needs to filter through to all of the programs. And so that's one of the other things we've been trying to help influence our partners in government to get there and be consistent with the goals that the state has for carbon neutralization. So, and then of course, as a lender, when I think about this, what do I require? Well, you know, I remember when I started working at CPC in 1991, and I was a lender in the field for 20 years, I remember that first phase one I read, and I thought, wow, we're going to make this guy do all this stuff. And we did. And we didn't have any extra money in our loan to pay for the removal of his asbestos, the tank to come out of the ground, the radon mitigation, or all the other things that come out of a phase one. But if he wanted access to the private capital, whether it was Sadie's Capital or Chase or Citibank or anybody else, he had to get that phase one and do that remediation. And so, you know, the mortgage market has tremendous power to try and drive demand. So I think about that. Not a very popular message when you're, you know, talking to the capitalist world that mortgage markets should be regulating carbon neutrality, but it's an idea. And I often have them. Sometimes my thought bubbles turn into lead cement shoes, but I nonetheless continue to try to have the thoughts. And then, of course, the last stop on the train is let's regulate it, which, of course, can be very powerful. And I love to use the example of Local Law 11 because who else wishes that they had bought stock in a scaffolding company the day Local Law 11 was passed? It's unbelievable to me. Everywhere you go in New York City, the amount of scaffolding that you see on buildings, and it's because of Local Law 11. People are doing facade restoration routinely because there's a law in place that says that they have to. And so now we have Local Law 97 and the whole list of other laws that Greg pointed out, and all of that is pushing us towards a carbon neutral economy and a clean grid. So you have to ask yourself, that's coming. There's going to be fines and penalties if we don't comply. Will that be enough to drive demand? So if you go to the next slide, when you're faced with this regulation, then what are our solutions to try to drive that demand? Well, branding and marketing, I'm going to come back to that. There's been some success with that in commercial office buildings that are LEED certified or, you know, LEED platinum, whatever, and there was some initial real like flurry of cachet associated with that. But we really need a broader public awareness campaign. I like to think of the Indian in the canoe in his otherwise pristine lake when he floated up to the pollution at the edge of the water and the you know, the tear ran down his face. I know I didn't pollute again after I saw that. That's a simple thing, but we need more of a public awareness around climate change. And maybe one of the silver linings with COVID-19 is that people become more aware of that which is outside of what's right in front of them. And then, of course, finding the resources to pay for it. Carbon taxation, will there be a carbon cap and trade system? Will the fines be enough? And then with my hat on, I think about the existing capital infrastructure that I behave within as an affordable housing lender, And there's lots of things that I rely on to make deals work. So a lot of deals wouldn't work if I didn't have a brownfield tax credit program. Can that be expanded to include carbon neutrality? I don't know. The LIHTC program, the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, you get a boost if you're in a high-cost area. Well, maybe you get a carbon boost if you're going to go to net zero. I don't know. You know, can we make carbon neutrality a floating opportunity zone? I'm very frustrated with these opportunity zones. I don't know how much they really work. But the idea of an opportunity zone, if it's not attached to a geography, but rather attached to something that's really important, like carbon neutrality, that might be an idea. And then, you know, the other thing that we use routinely in affordable housing are tax abatements. So I don't know if there's some way, you know, to create a tax abatement program around carbon neutrality. These are all just ideas that I share with you as we go through today, because the goal of today is to try to help you think beyond your day-to-day to what would help me, what would make me want to do this, and what do I use every day that I can attach this to that would incent me and drive the demand for me to do this more. And then, of course, there's making it a requirement, National Building Code, we talked about that. And then there is government regulation of private capital. If you think of the Community Reinvestment Act, which requires banks to invest in low and moderate income neighborhoods, maybe there's a requirement for banks to invest in carbon neutral technology or clean energy. I don't know. Or maybe the money that you borrow, you have to borrow, you know, the buildings that you're financing have to come to some level of carbon neutrality. So then when you go to the next slide, you know, we ask the question, where are we now? Well, to all the building owners and the moms and the pops that I have financed for the last, you know, 29 years, you know, we have to do this. We have to address this need, and we have to change the way we operate buildings and use energy. I like to say that a vacant building uses no energy and emits no carbon. And we're seeing that now with COVID-19, where the amount of energy being used has been driven down dramatically because people aren't in buildings. It's really not the buildings themselves, it's the way we operate them and the behavior of the people inside of them, including the people that manage the systems in those buildings. And so, you know, there's a choir of dedicated professionals, I consider myself one of them, that have been focused on this and will continue to be focused on this every day. But, you know, that's the choir. We need, the whole world to sing the same song. And the question we ask today is, how do we make this a focus of the people who actually own and develop and operate multifamily buildings, and who transact in and around multifamily buildings and make their living around multifamily buildings? And that's the list that Greg read before, and it's a long list, not just what I have on this slide. So we need more ideas around what would raise this up for you and for people who are not currently in the choir. And we want to hear what's hard about this for you so that we can try to come up with some solutions. Obviously, Greg took you through what NYSERDA is doing with the roadmap. And then I have just two final slides, so if we can go to the next slide. It is topical, so I am going to talk about COVID-19 and the climate. There are as Greg pointed out, there are similarities in the response that's required for climate change and what we're seeing in COVID-19. And the COVID-19 response has obviously been compressed into a very, very, very short period of time. But both demand aggressive action to minimize loss. Both have a curve effect that we need to flatten. When it's not done in the climate side, what we're seeing are wildfires, extreme weather events, flooding. All of that is very real. And people don't make the direct connection to the climate, but there is a direct connection. Industry can really power this change. We obviously have to embrace the science and the evidence and really need to come together to combat climate change. You know, human psychology is tough. We are really bad at thinking about tomorrow, but we need to intervene and curb and change behavior. Because when we work together, whether it's under emergency circumstances or collaboratively and thoughtfully like we need to do for climate change, if you go to the last slide, what it shows is that it actually can be done. Now, the last thing it says on this slide is this is not to be seen as a silver lining. That's not my point. This is not a sustainable way to reduce air pollution the last 3 weeks at all. But you can see that versus the first 3 weeks in March in 2019 versus the first 3 weeks in March in 2020, the substantial reduction from, that many cars off the road. When you hear that soundbite, oh, it takes so many cars off the road, it really is true when you do that, and this is a dramatic representation of that. When you drive down energy usage in the buildings that we operate and behave and live in, you truly can make a difference. So that's my presentation, and I'm going to hand it back over to you, Greg, or to Scott.
Thank you so much, Sadie. That was great. And